Welcome to The Timeless Mind, your fast track to life-changing wisdom from the world's most powerful books. If you crave the timeless lessons of the greatest minds but don't have hours to spare, well, you're in the right place. This is Series 2, Episode 1, The Republic. Justice, Power, and the Ideal Society. Let's dive in.
Plato's Republic. It's a huge work,
Yeah.
a really massive philosophical dialogue.
Yeah, it is.
So for this deep dive, we're going to focus on some core ideas. We're going to look at what is justice, what is the nature of power, and can we even imagine a blueprint for an ideal society?
Right.
And we've, gone through it all to bring you the most important insights.
Awesome. So where does Plato start us off? I mean, this is a big topic, right? Justice, the ideal state. Where does he begin this exploration?
Well, he begins very vividly, actually. It starts in the Piraeus, that's the bustling port of Athens.
Okay.
Socrates and his friend Glaucon, they're heading down to the Piraeus for a festival.
Okay.
And as they're about to head back to the city, they run into Polemarchus. And Polemarchus is like, no, you guys have to come to my house. It's,
It's not an option.
not really an invitation you can refuse in ancient Athens.
All right.
So they end up at Polemarchus's house for this sort of impromptu philosophical gathering.
I love it. Okay, so who else is there? Who's part of this brain trust?
Oh, it's an interesting group. We've got Polemarchus and his brothers, Lysias and Euthydemus.
Okay.
And then we have some other prominent figures at the time, like Thrasymachus. He's there, and he's going to have a lot to say about justice, as we'll see.
Okay.
We also have Charmantides and Cleitophon.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of presiding over it all is Cephalus, Polemarchus's elderly father.
Mm-hmm.
He's just finished performing a sacrifice. He's got his garland on. He looks very distinguished.
I love it. It's a
Yeah.
real scene.
Yeah,
So the stage is set.
right.
Now, how does this conversation turn to justice? I mean, how does it naturally kind of flow to this big idea?
Well, it starts with Cephalus, actually. He's the elder statesman here. He starts talking about how, the benefits of being just, especially as you get older.
Yeah.
He brings up things like settling your debts and having a clear conscience, as you face death, the end of life.
Makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
But the real debate kicks off when Socrates, in typical Socrates fashion, he starts engaging with Polemarchus.
Okay.
Polemarchus brings up this idea from the poet Simonides that justice is about giving each person what they're owed.
Okay.
Good to your friends, harm to your enemies.
Right. The classic. I mean,
Yeah.
I think even today, that's how a lot of people think about it.
Right. A very sort of, I don't know, traditional way of thinking about justice.
Yeah.
So Socrates, he starts poking holes in this definition, right?
Yeah.
He's like, okay, if justice is all about inflicting harm on your enemies, then what's its use in times of peace?
Makes sense.
He even uses analogies from other crafts like medicine. Medicine is for healing. Cooking is for preparing food. What specific good does justice actually accomplish, especially when there's no conflict going on? And then he gets really playful. He's like, well, would a just person even be a good partner in a game of drafts? Or would someone who was skilled at the game be more helpful? He's trying to get at this idea that Polemarchus's definition of justice is kind of situational. It doesn't really get at something universal about justice.
Okay, so it sounds like Socrates is pushing them towards a deeper, more kind of fundamental understanding.
Exactly.
And this is where Thrasymachus makes his dramatic entrance, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the guy doesn't hold back.
Thrasymachus bursts into the conversation. He's like, you guys are all just talking in circles.
He's frustrated.
Right. He's like, give me a clear definition of justice. And he's very specific. He's like, don't tell me about necessity, benefit, advantage, profit, or anything good.
Oh.
He wants a very precise, forceful answer. And then he gives it himself.
Okay, what is it?
He says, justice is simply what is advantageous for the stronger.
Advantageous for the stronger. Wow, so he's basically saying that justice is just a tool of the powerful?
Exactly. He's arguing that in any society, whether it's ruled by a king or an aristocracy or even a democracy, the ruling group, the stronger, they make laws that serve their own interests. And whatever they declare to be just is really just whatever benefits them, whatever keeps them in power.
Okay.
So justice is not some independent moral standard. It's just a way for those in control to stay in control.
Right.
And he uses this analogy, I don't know if you'd like this, of shepherds and sheep.
Okay.
He's saying that shepherds, they only care about their own gain. They're fattening up the sheep, not for the sheep's benefit, but for their wool and their meat. And he's basically saying that's how he sees rulers.
Wow. Okay, so rulers are looking after themselves, and they call whatever helps them justice. All right, so how does Socrates counter that? I mean, this is a pretty bleak view.
Well, Socrates doesn't just take this lying down.
No, he doesn't.
He comes back with this argument that any true art, any craft, when practiced properly, aims at the benefit of the object, not the person doing it.
Okay.
So think about a doctor caring for a patient.
Yeah.
The doctor's skill is focused on healing the patient,
Right.
right? Or a shipbuilder building a ship. They're not building it for themselves, they're building it for the ship's sake, to make a seaworthy vessel.
Right.
And Socrates says that ruling is like that too.
Okay.
A true ruler, a good ruler, works for the good of the people they're governing, not just for their own personal gain.
Interesting. Okay.
And then he brings up this really fascinating idea.
Yeah.
He says that the best leaders, the best rulers, are actually the ones who have to be persuaded to rule,
Oh, that's interesting.
because they're not in it for power or personal gain. Their motivation is to avoid the shame of not using their talents and their abilities to serve the community.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, that's a different way of thinking about what makes a good leader.
Right.
It's not ambition.
Yeah.
It's almost like a sense of duty.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a good point. So how does Thrasymachus, does he buy this? Or what happens next?
Oh, Thrasymachus, he is not one to back down easily.
Right.
He doubles down and says, no, being unjust is actually more profitable than being just.
Wow.
He goes even further and says that the ideal life, the best possible life, would be one of perfect injustice.
Okay.
Especially if you can maintain the appearance of being just.
Wow. Yeah.
So imagine, he says, someone who secretly does all these unjust things, acts purely in their own self-interest, even if it harms others. But they have this flawless reputation. They seem totally just to everyone.
All right, so get all the benefits of being bad, but none of the consequences.
Yeah.
Because everyone thinks you're good.
Exactly. That's his cynical, I guess, recipe for success.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a classic dilemma, right? If you could get away with it, wouldn't that be the best outcome? To appear virtuous but actually be ruthless when it benefits you? What does Socrates say to that?
Well, Socrates takes on this argument in a couple of really interesting ways. First, he says that injustice actually creates this internal conflict and division,
Okay.
whether it's within a city, an army, a group of people, or even within an individual person.
Yeah.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. And injustice breeds this kind of internal strife that makes it really hard to get anything done, to work together effectively. Then he brings up this idea of the soul having a function, a purpose.
Okay.
It's about managing, ruling, making decisions, living a good life. And he argues that injustice, by creating all this internal discord, it prevents the soul from performing its function properly. It's like a broken tool. It can't do its job.
Right. So injustice is not just, ethically problematic. It actually hinders your ability to just function.
Exactly. And just at this point, when it seems like maybe Socrates is winning the argument, Glaucon and Adimantus jump in.
Oh, okay.
They're not necessarily convinced by Thrasymachus' whole injustice is more profitable thing,
Okay.
but they're not totally satisfied with Socrates' response either.
Okay, so what's their issue?
They basically say, look, you haven't really addressed why justice is valuable in and of itself.
Okay.
Like, regardless of external rewards or punishments.
Right. The intrinsic value of justice.
Exactly. And Glaucon, to make this point, he tells this really compelling story. It's about a guy who does all sorts of unjust things. He lies, he cheats, he steals, but he has this perfect reputation. Everyone thinks he's this amazing, just person.
Wow.
He gains wealth, power. He even seems to have the favor of the gods.
It's the ultimate test case.
Right. He's like, if you could get away with it, wouldn't that be the best outcome?
Yeah.
Why bother being truly just if you can just seem just and reap all the rewards?
Right.
And Adimantus, he adds to this by bringing up all these common beliefs of their time, that, the gods often reward the wicked and punish the good.
Uh-huh.
He even quotes poets like Pindar and Homer who say these kinds of things.
Yeah.
So he's basically saying that being just might actually lead to suffering.
Yeah.
So they're really challenging Socrates to show the inherent value of justice, like why it benefits the person who possesses it, even if they face hardship and are seen as unjust by others.
Right. Strip away all the external stuff and show that justice is valuable in its own right.
Exactly.
So this is a huge challenge. I mean, how does Socrates even begin to tackle this?
He takes a really interesting approach. Instead of trying to define justice right away, he says, let's look at justice on a larger scale. Let's look at justice in a city.
Okay, so Zoom out a little bit.
Yeah, his thinking is that justice might be easier to see in a bigger entity, like a whole community.
Right.
So he proposes they construct like an ideal city in their minds, what he calls a Callipolis, and see where justice emerges within that.
Okay, so build a utopia.
Right. And then from that, maybe we can understand justice in the individual soul. It's like saying, let's look at the big picture first to understand the smaller details.
Right.
Interesting approach.
So they start with this very basic city. Socrates calls it the city of pigs.
The city of pigs. Okay.
It's like this really simple, almost primitive society.
Okay.
Everyone just does what's necessary for survival, farming, building shelter. It's a healthy existence, but it's very basic.
Got it.
And Glaucon immediately is like, no way, this is way too boring. This is not an ideal city.
Yeah, not very inspiring.
He wants luxuries, he wants comforts, he wants culture.
Yeah.
So they start adding things to the city to make it more appealing.
Okay, so how does the city of pigs evolve? What comes next?
Well, it expands, right?
Yeah.
New occupations arise.
You get hunters to provide more food, artists and poets to create beauty, merchants to trade goods, all kinds of craftspeople. So the city becomes more complex, more specialized.
Okay.
And this brings up a really important principle for Socrates' specialization.
Specialization.
He argues that for the city to function well, for it to produce high-quality goods and services, each person should focus on the task they're naturally best suited for.
Okay, that makes sense.
He uses the example of a shoemaker.
Okay.
It's like a shoemaker should stick to making shoes. That's what he's good at.
Right, don't try to be a farmer or a weaver on the side.
Right. Focus on your strengths and the whole city will benefit.
So specialization is about efficiency and expertise.
Exactly.
But how does this tie back to the idea of justice in the city?
Well, the idea is that when everyone is fulfilling their specific role, the role they're best suited for, and they're not meddling in the affairs of others, then the whole city runs smoothly.
Okay, so a well-ordered city.
Right. And this state of harmony and order, where each part of the city is doing its proper job, is what Socrates is going to connect to justice.
Oh, okay.
But as the city grows, it gets more complex. Now you need protection.
Yeah.
You need people to defend it.
Right.
So this is where the need for a special class of people arises. The guardians.
The guardians. Okay. These are the warriors, the protectors. What does Plato think these guardians need to be like? What qualities are essential?
He says they need a really specific and kind of paradoxical combination of qualities. They need to be both gentle and spirited.
Gentle and spirited. That's interesting.
Yeah. Gentle and kind towards their fellow citizens, the people they're protecting.
Right.
But then spirited, brave, fierce towards the city's enemies.
Yeah, so like a balance of strength and compassion.
Right. Finding this combination is a challenge, so he uses this analogy of a well-bred watchdog.
Okay, I like that.
The dog is gentle and loving with its family, with people it knows. But it's totally fierce and protective against strangers or anyone who threatens its home.
Right. So that's the kind of temperament they're looking for in the guardians.
Exactly. Gentle on the inside, fierce on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And this leads to this whole question of education, like how do you cultivate these qualities?
Yeah, you can't just, snap your fingers and make guardians. You have to train them.
Right.
So what does Plato think about, what should their upbringing be like?
Education is central to the whole idea of the Republic.
Okay.
And Socrates, he believes that early education is especially crucial.
Yeah, makes sense.
Like the stories and myths that children are exposed to when they're young, they shape their whole character, their understanding of the world.
Makes sense.
So he argues that you have to be super careful about the kinds of stories that you tell them.
Okay.
For example, he says, you should absolutely forbid any stories that misrepresent the gods.
What does he mean by misrepresent? Like, give me an example.
Like stories where the gods are shown as being flawed, deceitful, engaging in, immoral behavior.
Okay.
He gives examples from Homer, like the gods fighting amongst themselves, or Achilles being all vengeful and, dragging Hector's body around.
Oh, right. Classic stories, but he's saying those are not the right models for the guardians.
Exactly. He's like, these stories, they instill the wrong values.
Okay.
They give you a distorted view of what's truly admirable.
Okay, so no more tales of quarreling gods for the young guardians. What kinds of stories should they be told? What's the alternative?
The key is truthfulness.
Truthfulness.
Stories about the gods should always depict them as they truly are, which is good,
Good.
unchanging,
Unchanging.
and incapable of deception.
Okay.
He reasons that change implies imperfection, right? Like, if you're perfect, why would you need to change?
Makes sense.
And deception is a sign of weakness, or like you're trying to hide something.
Right. Yeah.
And that's incompatible with the God's perfect nature.
Okay, so truth and unwavering goodness. Those are the models. What about lying in general? Like, is there ever a time when lying is okay in Plato's ideal city?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Socrates actually says that there might be very specific situations where it's okay for the rulers to lie,
Okay.
but only for the benefit of the city as a whole.
Okay, so the classic example being, you're at war, you need to deceive your enemy.
Right, or maybe even with their own citizens,
Okay.
if it's to prevent some greater harm.
Right.
But he emphasizes, he's like, this lying business, this is strictly for the rulers.
Right. Yeah, the guardians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For anyone else to lie to them would be a huge offense. It's like a patient lying to their doctor about their symptoms.
Right. Yeah, that undermines the whole system.
Exactly.
Okay, so truth is paramount, but there might be a carefully controlled kind of noble lie for the sake of
You're the greater good.
for the greater good. Okay, so we've talked about the content of the stories, but what about the style? Like, how are these stories told? What role does, say, poetry and music play in the Guardian's education?
Oh, Socrates goes on and on about the importance of music
Okay.
and poetic education. He talks about the power of rhythm and melody, the effect they have on the soul.
Okay.
He believes that the right kinds of music can instill grace and harmony and a love of beauty.
Okay.
But then, of course, the wrong kinds of music
Right.
can do the opposite.
Yeah.
He gives this example contrasting Apollo and his instruments, which are very disciplined and refined,
Okay.
with the sounds of Marsyas.
Okay. Yeah.
Marsyas is associated with these more like wild, chaotic sounds.
Okay, so the order versus chaos.
Right, exactly. And Socrates is definitely on the side of Apollo here.
Makes sense.
He's like, you need that order, that harmony to cultivate a virtuous character.
Right.
And the aim is not just to appreciate music aesthetically. It's about developing a soul that instinctively recognizes and loves what is good and beautiful and hates what is ugly and bad.
So music education, it's not just about entertainment, it's about shaping the soul.
It's about shaping the soul.
Okay, I like that. What about physical education? How does that fit in?
Physical education is super important too.
Okay.
But Socrates is very clear that it needs to be closely tied to the development of the soul.
Okay, interesting.
He believes that a good soul can make the body as good as it's capable of being.
Okay.
But just having a great body, that doesn't automatically lead to a good soul.
Right.
He warns against, focusing too much on physical training at the expense of everything else. He says that can lead to a savage, uncivilized character.
Okay.
And then on the flip side, he says if you focus too much on music and poetry and neglect physical training, you can end up soft and lacking spirit.
Right.
So the ideal is this balance.
Okay, balance.
You nurture both the body and the mind in a way that promotes virtue.
Okay, I like that. So a balanced education for mind and body, all aimed at fostering virtue in these future guardians. So we've kind of gone through their education, but what about their lifestyle? Like, how do these guardians live once they're, grown up and they're in charge of the city?
Their whole way of life is designed to prevent them from becoming corrupt.
Okay.
Socrates doesn't want them to be tempted by, personal gain or self-interest.
Right, yeah. You don't want the guardians to become the problem.
Exactly. So he proposes this very austere lifestyle for them.
Okay, how so?
They live communally.
Communally.
They don't own private property.
Okay.
They share meals.
Okay.
And their focus is always on the well-being of the entire community,
Right.
not on themselves or even their own families.
Interesting. Okay.
And Socrates is very clear. He's like, the goal of the city is the happiness of the whole.
Right.
Not just the happiness of one particular group.
Mhm.
And he also warns about the dangers of extreme wealth and poverty.
Okay.
He's like, both of those things can really mess things up, even for skilled workers.
Right. They can disrupt the harmony.
Exactly.
Okay. So the guardians live a very simple, dedicated life, focused on the common good. But how does this structure contribute to the overall qualities of the city?
Socrates argues that the city as a whole will be wise in counsel and truly wise because of its smallest group,
Interesting.
the guardians.
Right. Because of their wisdom.
Right, because of their knowledge and their training.
Okay.
So wisdom resides in the rulers, the guardians. Then you have courage, and that's attributed to the auxiliaries.
The auxiliaries.
These are the warriors who actually, carry out the guardians' decisions.
Right, as a soldier.
They're the ones who defend the city. And then you have this other quality, self-discipline, or in Greek, sophrosyne.
Sophrosyne. Okay.
This is defined as like the agreement of all the classes in the city about who should rule. It's that shared acceptance of the established order.
Okay.
And finally, you have justice.
Justice.
And justice in the city, it happens when each part, the guardians, the auxiliaries, the producing class, everyone, they're all fulfilling their specific function and not interfering with others. It's like a perfectly functioning machine.
Yeah, where all the parts are working together.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that. It's like a well-oiled machine. So we've got this analogy of the city with different parts, and then Socrates extends this analogy to the individual soul.
Right.
Right. He's like, the city is like a big soul.
He draws a direct parallel between the three classes of the city and the three parts of the soul.
Okay.
So you have the rational part of the soul.
Okay.
That's the part that desires truth and knowledge, and that corresponds to the guardians.
Okay.
Then you have the spirited part.
Spirited.
That's associated with courage and anger.
Okay.
And that's like the auxiliaries.
Right, the warriors.
And then finally, you have the appetitive part, or the desiring part.
Okay.
This is the part that wants, bodily pleasures, material goods.
Right, the basic stuff.
And that's like the producing class.
Okay.
So justice in the individual soul happens when these three parts are in harmony.
Harmony.
With the rational part guiding and ruling the other two, just like the guardians rule the city.
Okay, so it's like a microcosm of the city within each person. Now, there's this really famous, and I'd say controversial aspect of the Republic, and that's this idea of equality for women and this whole concept of communal living arrangements for the guardians, which includes shared spouses and children. I mean, this is some really radical stuff.
It was mind-blowing for its time.
Yeah.
So Socrates, he makes this argument that if women have the same natural talents and capacities as men, particularly the intellectual and spirited qualities needed to be a guardian, then they should receive the same education and they should be allowed to do the same jobs.
Right. So it's not about gender, it's about ability.
Exactly. And he's directly challenging the traditional view that men and women have separate roles.
Right, which was very common in ancient Greece.
Yeah, very common.
Okay. And then this leads to this even more radical idea of communal spouses and children for the guardian class. I mean, that's a huge departure from the traditional family structure.
It is.
So what's the reasoning behind that? Why does he propose this?
The main goal is to create this really strong sense of unity within the guardian class.
Okay.
And to eliminate like private family loyalties that might conflict with their loyalty to the city.
Right. So it's about putting the city first above your own individual family.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he's like, if everyone shares spouses and children, then they'll develop this collective sense of mine and not mine.
Right.
Everyone is family.
So that strengthens their bond to the whole city.
Exactly. It reduces those individual biases and favoritism that can arise from, having your own little nuclear family.
Yeah, it's about preventing nepotism, self-interest.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he even goes so far as to propose these marriage festivals where the rulers would carefully arrange pairings to produce the best possible offspring.
Wow. Okay. So regulated breeding.
Regulated breeding.
Wow. I mean, that's taking it to the next level.
It's all about creating the best possible guardians for the city.
Right.
Their loyalty is to the city. Their purpose is to serve the city.
Got it. Okay, now what about warfare?
Okay.
I mean, this is ancient Greece. Warfare is a reality. What does Plato think about, the guardians as soldiers and the ethics of war?
So the guardians are the warriors, right?
Right.
They're the ones who defend the city. And Socrates lays out some very specific rules of engagement.
Okay, what are those?
Well, first he says Greeks should not enslave other Greeks.
Okay.
That's only for barbarians, for non-Greeks.
Okay, so there's a distinction there.
Yeah, a very clear distinction.
Okay.
He also says you shouldn't destroy farmland or burn houses during war. So a bit more of a kind of restrained approach to warfare than was typical at the time.
Right, a little more humane, perhaps.
Yeah.
Now, throughout all this discussion of the ideal city, Glauca brings up a really important point.
Yeah.
He's like, is this even possible?
Right.
Is this realistic?
Yeah.
This sounds great in theory, but can you actually build this kind of city?
Right. He's raising that question of practicality.
Exactly.
And Socrates, he acknowledges that. He's like, look, maybe this ideal city, it exists primarily in theory.
Okay.
It's a blueprint. It's a model.
Right.
The goal is not necessarily to create it exactly as we described it, but to try to get as close to it as possible.
Right. So it's a goal to strive for.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then he makes this really famous statement.
Okay.
He says, for this ideal city to be realized, either philosophers must become kings or kings must become philosophers.
The philosopher-king.
The philosopher-king.
Right. This is one of the most well-known ideas from the Republic. But what does he mean by a true philosopher?
Right.
It's got to be more than just someone who likes to think.
Yeah. It's definitely more than just someone who's bookish or enjoys intellectual debates.
Okay.
A true philosopher, for Plato, is someone who loves wisdom, truly loves it,
Yeah.
and they've actually attained knowledge of the forms.
The forms. Okay. Now, this is getting into some deep philosophical territory. Explain the forms for us. What are those?
The forms are like the essences of things.
Right.
They're the unchanging, eternal, perfect blueprints.
Okay.
So you have the form of justice, the form of beauty, the form of goodness.
Okay.
These are the ultimate objects of knowledge.
Okay, so they exist beyond the physical world.
Right. They exist beyond the physical world. They're not like the things we see around us, which are imperfect and constantly changing.
Right.
Think of the forms as the perfect models that all the things in.